So good afternoon to all of you. Buonasera, buenas tardes, bona tarda, also in Catalan, in case somebody from Catalonia is also following us. Welcome back to all of you, and a special welcome to those who follow us via streaming. We will now hear a brief presentation of a small exhibit, Pharisees in Art, which some of you have already watched, I imagine, in the Biblicum, on the opposite side of the piazza, and which will remain accessible throughout this week. The project was initiated with much enthusiasm and dedication by Dr. Yvonne Donna Schlobitten, and we are very grateful to her, even if she is not here with us now. Because of other important commitments, she decided to pass it on to Dr. Angela DELFA, a former student of hers who specialized in her doctorate here at the Gregorian University. She specialized on iconography and continues along similar lines in her teaching. We are really grateful to her for having taken over this project with great expertise and diligence, despite the rather limited time available. She will have 15 minutes to make her presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So, identifying an iconography of the Pharisees is an attempt to enter a fairly unexplored world. In fact, there are no specific studies on the subject, which instead happens extensively on the iconography of Jews in general. And this is not at all a coincidence, since the iconography of the Pharisees in Western figurative art, mainly, if not solely of Christian origin, almost always coincides with that of the Jew. The reference point for Jewish iconography is certainly the unsurpassed publications by Heinz Schreckenberg. The fact that iconography of the Pharisees is a minor aspect of the representation of the Jews is certainly determined by the fact that although they appear relatively extensively in the Gospels, figurative art can only count on a few figurative traditions concerning them. Some iconography subjects are rare, learned quotations from the Gospels or Christian Apocrypha. The figurative tradition, starting from sacred scripture, has connoted their representation negatively, as it is presented most often in biblical passages where the role of Pharisees as antagonists of Jesus is evident. However, sometimes there are episodes in the Gospels where the role of Pharisees is not so negatively connoted, with effects also on the figurative art that does not always prove to be so adverse to their depiction. Further, the art of the early centuries does not always prove to be so adverse to their depiction. In the early centuries, in fact, the art produced since the 12th and the 13th centuries, the aversion toward the Jews and all other religious minorities in Europe was formalized by the laws of the time. This resulted in the obligation dictated by the Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, for the Jews to wear clothes that distinguished them from Christians. The Canon 68 of the Lateran Council was incorporated in 1234 into canon law and lasted for centuries. The Council required that in Christian Europe, Jews should retain what it was considered their traditional Oriental form of dress, which included the canonical hat and the full-length garments. So, in the Middle Ages, a new cultural situation developed, since in antiquity clothing was not usually the distinguished feature of a group, and the diaspora Jews were not easily recognizable. Soon, the group of Pharisees was also framed in the medieval figurative tradition, making it particularly complex to distinguish them from other Jews. However, in figurative art, there are some characteristics that distinguish them and allows us to identify a Pharisee with respect to the components of other Jewish groups. The exhibition is divided into 5 panels, of which each one focuses on an iconographic theme. The first is dedicated to the iconography of the Pharisee and the tax collector. The following panels report the iconographic traditions of Jesus' dialogues with the Pharisees, the trial and passion of Christ, the woman taken in adultery, and Nicodemus. The first panel reproductions mark a first differentiation between a Pharisee and another Jew. It is evident how, almost always in the representation of these two characters, the Pharisee is the elder one with beard, dressed more richly, and with a self-confident and arrogant attitude. On the other hand, the tax collector is usually younger, with a beardless face, or at least not with a long beard, dressed more humbly and with a more modest and shameful attitude. This iconography, which emerges as the traditional one from the Middle Ages onwards, is testified in the folio 156 recto of the manuscript Vita Christi, and is also maintained in the 2 subsequent works of art of the exhibition. That is the fresco by Johann Jakob and Franz Anton Zeller, and the plate by Julius Knorr von Karosfeld. From this tradition, we can identify the iconography of the typical Pharisee, from the rich clothing with headdress, which often overlaps with that of the scribes and high priests of the temple, the other 2 groups of the Gospel whose iconography ends up to be confused with that of the Pharisees. Moreover, the iconography of the Pharisees is adopted in figurative art not only for their physical features and for their wealth, and for their wealth witnessed by their clothes, but also for the representation of their attitude, especially in their relationship with Jesus. The second exhibition panel is dedicated to the dialogues between Jesus and the Pharisees, and to the iconography that derives from the well-known passage of Matthew 23, in which Jesus speaks of the hypocrisy and of the scribes and Pharisees. The first work in this section, the folio 130 of the Evangeliary of Cambrai, is one of the first representations of the Pharisee as medieval Jews wearing the clothing dictated by the Fourth Lateran Council. The next 2 images show a rare and sophisticated iconography that allows us to identify with greater accuracy the iconographic characteristics of the Pharisees. The miniature hypocrisy of the scribes and Pharisees, which is part of the Oldham Bible, is a parody. At the bottom right, the Pharisees and the scribes, depicted as sitting on the seat of Moses, are characterized by their blindness, as in Matthew 23, Jesus calls the Pharisees blind guides. One holds the 2 tables of the law before his eyes like a pair of spectacles, which distort his vision, while 2 others have a 2-fold table on their foreheads. The miniature representing Christ teaching and warning against scribes and Pharisees of the manuscript Vita Christi represents one of the most interesting pages for the representation of the Pharisees. One Pharisee, wearing a pointed hat and gesturing, sits on the throne beneath a green canopy. He is flanked by other Pharisees and scribes, most wearing hats. all standing. One is holding a parchment with pseudo-inscription in his left hand, indicated with the finger by the seated Pharisee, probably to signify that the law is central. In both representation, the rhetoric is evident. The aim is to represent the Pharisees as attached to the letter of the law and as too blind to open their minds to the teaching of Christ. The third exhibition panel allows us to deepen the investigation about the depiction of the Pharisees through the iconographic theme of Passion of Jesus. One of the main themes in Western art, as you probably know, it has certainly determined a consolidation of hostile attitudes to the Jew, often representing them as the executioners of Jesus and finally imposing on them the collective guilt of his death. Because the biblical passages, especially in the Gospel of John, often speak of Jews in general, finding where exactly the Pharisees acted in the passion and death of Jesus becomes particularly complex. Consequently, the figurative culture from the Middle Ages onwards has represented the Jews generically rather than dwelling on the differences of the groups. But there is at least one episode in the Gospel of John 11, where the Pharisees are represented as those responsible, together with the chief priests, for having decided to arrest Jesus. There is no highly developed iconography of this episode, but there are some examples of great interest. In the first two works of art, we have chosen for the exhibition the one of the Vita Christi and the plate 79 of the Evangeliche Historiae Imagines by the Jesuit Jérôme Nadal. We find the representation of the council held by the Pharisees and the chief priests that pronounced the death of Jesus. In it, we can locate the most precise iconography to identify the Pharisees in figurative art. They are wearing pointed hats and a precise clothing including a petticoat to the feet, an overcoat and a chasuble, tightened at the waist by a belt, and a shawl richly decorated. This is a very well established There is a very well established iconographic tradition concerning the deposition from the cross, the burial and the exposition of Jesus as man of sorrows. Most of the times, in all three traditions, Nicodemus is also present as mere bearer and as the richest figure. In the painting by Roger van der Weyden, he is the one who wears the yellow damask mantle, the most sumptuous costume in the painting. Certainly, the iconographic tradition that concerns him contrasts with the more negative tradition of the council against Jesus and makes it clear that at the time there was a variety of positions on Jesus. The fourth exhibition panel is dedicated to the iconographic theme inspired by the narrative of the woman taken in adultery, among the most represented in figurative art. It has two variants, both widespread. The first sees Jesus writing on the floor, while the second sees him interacting directly with the scribes and Pharisees. In these representations, the scribes and Pharisees assume the most diversified facial expressions and reactions. In folio 24 of the Narratio Germanica Passionis Domini, the adulteress is represented as a Renaissance lady, while on the left and those on the right, closer to her, were the most varied forms of Jewish hats. The masterpiece by Rembrandt testifies how the artist was unusually receptive and empathetic towards Jews, while in the late Baroque monumental fresco by Franz Xaver Dobler, we have the definitive identification by Western culture of the adulteress with Mary Magdalene. Surely it is one of the few cases in which this theme is the main church decoration And this is the reason why the group of scribes and Pharisees is more populated and differentiated here than in any other representation. The fifth and final exhibition panel is dedicated to the figure of Nicodemus, who is the most represented Pharisee in figurative art. Here there are two different figurative traditions. The first, which is rarer, is represented by the miniature of the legendary Savoia Sforza, which depicts the encounter between Nicodemus and Jesus, taking place outdoors and in public, when the representation of this iconographic subject normally has a private dimension of a dialogue that takes place between them only. Nicodemus, a wise Pharisee, is depicted as an old man, bearded and richly dressed in the fashion of the Italian 15th century. The two other works follow the second and more common iconographic tradition of the encounter between Nicodemus and Jesus. The one by the Dutch Caravagist Krijn Hendrits Volmarin, author of at least two paintings with the same subject, depicts Nicodemus with a turban, rich robes, and a full beard, sitting at a table on which rests a candelabrum with lit candles that softly illuminate the scene. In front of him and Jesus there are closed books and an open one, perhaps imagined as the Torah or rabbinic teachings. Here the scene corresponds to the Gospel, which speaks of a visit at night. In the etching by Jean-Pierre Mariette, representing Christ instructing Nicodemus, the intimacy of the encounter between Jesus and Nicodemus is accompanied by a more communitarian dimension, typical of a Lutheran reading of the Bible. This time, the figures are depicted in their entirety, which makes the iconography of the classical Pharisee better visible. Nicodemus has the garments that we have noticed in previous depictions, such as the petticoat reaching to the feet, a chasuble tightened at the waist by a belt, again, and a rich shawl. As we move toward the Baroque and modern era, the hat associated with Jews loses its pointed shape and has become either of a soft, rounded shape or a turban. Not all the iconographic themes could find space in the exhibition. Other themes include the supper at the house of Simon, in which the iconography of the Pharisee once again confirms the result of the present research. However, we have delineated the first step by identifying some fixed points in understanding artistic depictions of Pharisees. Among these is the actual presence in figurative art in close connection with those gospel passages in which their involvement is expressly mentioned. The main iconographic themes that concern their representation have also been fixed, as well as the knowledge of what distinguishes the iconographic model of a typical Pharisee, identifiable through clothing and psychophysical characteristics. Another aspect important to remember is that figurative art, in a number of cases, has been able to find the right balance in relating to depiction of the Pharisees. They are present, but in most cases there is not a highly negative presence, especially in the episodes of the dialogues with Jesus. Surely the historical evolution of Christian attitudes toward Jews has also determined the way in which the Pharisees were portrayed, whether conflating them with all the Jews or distinguish among groups, whether confirming the prejudice against them or creating sympathy for them. Thank you.